The first thing most passengers noticed about him that morning was how quietly he boarded. No rushing, no sighs of frustration as people fumbled with carry-ons, no impatient toe-tapping in the jet bridge. He moved with a deliberate rhythm, his small roller bag gliding behind him, the wheels making a faint rattling sound on the metal walkway. A charcoal gray hoodie framed his face, the hood pulled halfway over dark hair that had been neatly brushed. His jeans were clean, his sneakers scuffed but tied tightly, and in his left hand, clutched carefully as if it might blow away in a sudden gust, was a small black notebook with the corner of a laminated card peeking out from between the pages. He didn't look at the passengers ahead of him, nor the ones behind. His eyes were down, focused on each step, as if boarding a commercial flight were not routine at all, but something to be done with precision. The flight attendant greeting passengers at the door offered him the same warm, "Good morning," she gave everyone else. He smiled back, a little shy, but it reached his eyes. "Morning," he said, voice soft but certain. It was Flight 2283, Dallas to Chicago, a Boeing 737 scheduled for a crisp 2-hour hop in clear skies. People were already stowing bags and sliding into their seats, the cabin buzzing with that peculiar mix of early travel energy and quiet fatigue. He stepped carefully into the narrow aisle, scanning the seat numbers until he reached row 14. He slid his roller bag into the overhead bin, hesitated to make sure it was secure, then settled into the middle seat, 14B, with the ease of someone who didn't mind middle seats. On his right, in 14A, a middle-aged man in a blazer was already tapping away at a laptop, eyes fixed on whatever quarterly report or urgent email demanded his attention. On his left, in 14C, sat a grandmotherly woman in a pastel sweater, smiling warmly as he buckled in. He returned the smile politely and set his black notebook on his lap. The laminated card, a colorful chart of aircraft instrument symbols, caught a brief reflection from the overhead lights. To most of the passengers around him, he was simply another traveler, perhaps heading to visit family or attend some appointment. His quiet demeanor, combined with the fact that he didn't pull out a phone or tablet, made him fade into the background almost instantly. That was the way it often was with Daniel Rios. People underestimated him at first glance, and in a way, that had become one of his quiet strengths. A few rows ahead, in seat 10A by the window, Colonel Richard Hayes adjusted the cuffs of his Navy sport coat and glanced absently out at the tarmac. He was in his early 60s, his hair a disciplined silver, his posture straight without thinking. He'd flown into and out of airports on 5 continents, both in uniform and out, but today he was just another passenger, his military career neatly folded away like the pressed clothes in his carry-on. He noticed the young man in row 14 only briefly, the careful, almost deliberate way he settled into his seat, before returning to the document he was reviewing. The boarding process carried on with its usual rhythm. Overhead bins slammed shut, passengers jostled for elbow room, and the soft hum of the air conditioning mixed with muffled conversations. Somewhere near the front, a toddler began to fuss, her mother bouncing her gently while apologizing to the people nearby. Daniel didn't mind the noise. He was focused on something else entirely. From his hoodie pocket, he pulled out a small, worn flight training manual, its corners rounded from use, a faint coffee ring staining the back cover. He opened it to a page marked with a post-it. Emergency procedures, power loss in cruise. His finger traced down the checklist, lips moving slightly as if reciting each step silently. The laminated card, now fully visible, was a VFR sectional chart of the Dallas area. It was folded neatly, the edges reinforced with tape where they had begun to fray. The grandmother in 14C noticed the book and leaned slightly toward him. "Are you studying for something, dear?" she asked. He looked up, a flicker of pride in his expression. "Yes, ma'am. I'm training to be a pilot." Her eyebrows rose in pleasant surprise. "Well, isn't that something? My nephew tried to take lessons once, but said it was harder than he thought." Daniel smiled faintly. "It can be hard. Lots to remember. But I like the challenge." And that was all he said, returning his gaze to the page. The man in 14A didn't look up from his laptop. But Hayes, a few rows ahead, overheard just enough of the exchange to file the detail away without really thinking about it. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the last passengers took their seats. The safety demonstration began, oxygen masks, life vests, exits fore and aft. Daniel followed along, eyes flicking to each location the attendant indicated, as though mentally rehearsing the steps. When the engine spooled up for taxi, The vibration underfoot was as familiar to him as the creak of a well-worn door at home. He closed his eyes briefly, imagining the smaller cockpit of the Cessna 172 he'd trained in, the smell of avgas, the tactile click of the flap lever under his hand. His first flight lesson had been 4 years ago, at a small airfield just outside San Antonio. The memory was etched into him like a photograph. His instructor, Sam Carter, standing beside the plane, sunglasses reflecting the bright Texas sun, looking skeptical but polite as Daniel's parents introduced him. Daniel had sensed the doubt immediately. He was used to it. People saw the almond-shaped eyes, the slight roundness of his features, the way his words sometimes came more carefully than others, and they assumed limits. But Daniel didn't let assumptions land without a fight. That first lesson had been a study in determination. Taxiing slowly down the narrow asphalt strip, his hands slightly damp on the yoke, he had listened intently to every instruction Carter gave. That day, they hadn't left the ground. Just practiced basic taxiing, learning the feel of the rudder pedals, understanding how wind affected the plane's movement. But when they shut down the engine, Carter had given him a rare nod. "You've got a steady touch," he'd said, almost surprised. Now, years later, Daniel was closing in on the hours needed for his private pilot's license. He knew his limitations, sure, but he also knew his strengths: obsessive preparation, a memory for checklists that bordered on photographic, and an instinct for staying calm when things got tricky. He had studied more than most of his classmates, flying in all kinds of weather, memorizing radio frequencies and emergency procedures until they were second nature. It wasn't just a hobby for him. It was a calling. The 737 taxied smoothly onto the runway, the engines rising to a powerful roar. Daniel felt the push against his back as the aircraft accelerated, nose lifting, the ground falling away. He watched out the window as the Dallas sprawl tilted and shrank, the morning sunlight glinting off rooftops and winding rivers. The climb was steady, the hum of the engines a reassuring constant. Around him, passengers relaxed into the routine of flight. Laptops opened, books came out, earbuds slipped in. Up front, Captain Laura Kingsley adjusted the autopilot settings, her co-pilot, Andrew Mercer, reading off climb checks. Kingsley had more than 2 decades in the cockpit, most of them uneventful in the way commercial aviation was meant to be. She was calm, precise, and well-liked by her crews. But this morning, as she sipped from her coffee, a faint shadow crossed her features. She rubbed at her temple briefly, dismissing the dull ache as just another early morning nuisance. Daniel sat back, still holding his notebook, eyes scanning the cabin. He noticed things others didn't: the way the flight attendants moved in sync, the subtle change in engine pitch as the climb leveled off, the gentle creak of the fuselage adjusting to altitude. It wasn't nervousness, it was awareness, the same awareness he'd been taught to cultivate in the cockpit. A few rows up, Hayes glanced back again. The young man in 14B was studying something intently. Not a novel or a phone, but a laminated diagram. Hayes could see it even from here. It was part of an instrument panel schematic. Interesting, he thought, before turning back to the window, watching the clouds drift below. The seatbelt sign chimed off. The cabin stirred with small movements. People heading for the lavatories, laptops coming out, snack orders being taken. Daniel opened his notebook again, flipping to a section on crosswind landings. He traced each diagram carefully, lips moving in quiet repetition of the steps. The grandmother in 14C chuckled softly. "You really do love this flying stuff, don't you?" Daniel's smile widened. "It's my dream. One day I'll be in the cockpit, flying people where they need to go." "You'll get there," she said kindly. "I can tell." And somewhere, in the quiet rhythm of the engines and the pressurized air, that dream felt as close as the next flight lesson, though neither Daniel nor anyone else knew just how soon he would be called to prove himself. The beverage carts began their slow journey down the aisle, the clink of ice scoops against plastic cups mingling with the muted murmur of passengers placing orders. The faint scent of brewed coffee drifted from the galley, cutting through the ever-present, sterile tang of pressurized air. Daniel closed his notebook, placing it carefully into the seat pocket in front of him, and folded his hands in his lap. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, the way someone might handle a sacred object. The grandmother beside him accepted a cup of ginger ale from the attendant, thanking her with the warmth of someone who still believed in politeness as a currency. Daniel ordered a water, his voice steady but soft, eyes flicking briefly to the galley where a second flight attendant was stacking trays. When the cup was handed to him, he held it with both hands, taking a small sip before setting it carefully on the tray table. From the corner of his eye, he could see 14A still pounding away on the laptop, brows furrowed, eyes locked on some spreadsheet. The man hadn't looked up once since takeoff. Daniel wondered, as he often did with strangers, where this man might be going. Was it a meeting? Was he someone's father or brother? In Daniel's mind, every person had a story. You just had to be paying attention to hear it. The engines droned in that steady, low hum that was oddly comforting to him. He imagined the two up front, Captain Kingsley and First Officer Mercer, in their seats surrounded by panels of switches, dials, and screens. He knew the layout of a 737 cockpit from memory, had studied photographs, diagrams, even sat in a full-motion simulator once during a summer camp program for aspiring pilots. He could picture the exact moment they switched from climb thrust to cruise, the autopilot handling the precision work while they monitored instruments and coordinated with ATC. His mind drifted to a memory that felt like yesterday, the day of his first solo flight. He'd been 21 then, older than most student pilots at that stage, but determined. His instructor, Sam Carter, had spent the morning running him through pattern work at Stinson Municipal Airport, touch and goes, simulated emergencies, radio calls. Daniel's landings had been solid, his radio clear, his checklist discipline unwavering. When they rolled to a stop on the taxiway, Carter had looked over, his expression unreadable. "All right, Daniel," he'd said finally, voice steady but not unkind. "I'm getting out. You're taking her up on your own." Daniel had swallowed hard, adrenaline spiking, but there was no fear in him. Not real fear, anyway, just that sharp edge of awareness that told him he was about to step into a moment he'd remember for the rest of his life. As Carter stepped onto the tarmac, Daniel went through the pre-takeoff checklist again from memory, then once more aloud, because that's what you did. You never cut corners. When the little Cessna's nose lifted off the ground and he realized it was only his hands and feet controlling it, the rush was unlike anything he'd known. He'd landed perfectly, taxied back to Carter, and only then allowed himself to grin like a boy who'd just found his wings. Back in 14B, Daniel's lips twitched at the memory. A slight bump interrupted his thoughts, just a patch of light chop. The captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth and practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're just encountering a little light turbulence. Nothing to worry about. Please keep your seatbelts fastened for now." Daniel noticed something in the tone. It was subtle, a fraction slower in cadence, a touch more measured. He filed it away, not as a red flag, but as a mental note. A few rows ahead, Hayes also caught it. Years of military flying had tuned his ear to the smallest shifts in a pilot's voice. He leaned slightly into the aisle, glancing toward the closed cockpit door, then sat back. No reason to assume trouble yet. But like Daniel, he was paying attention. The turbulence passed as quickly as it had come, the engines resuming their steady song. Passengers went back to reading, watching movies, scrolling through their phones. Daniel pulled out his laminated sectional chart again, tracing his finger along a marked route, imagining radio handoffs and altitude changes, just as he did in training flights. "Are you going to be an airline pilot someday?" the grandmother asked suddenly. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "That's the plan. Still a long way to go, but yeah, one day." She smiled. "I hope I'm on one of your flights." He chuckled softly. "I'd make sure it was a good one." The way he said it carried a quiet confidence, not arrogance, just certainty born from preparation. Up in the cockpit, Kingsley shifted in her seat, rolling her shoulders. She'd been fighting a headache since boarding, but now it seemed sharper, almost pulsing. She took another sip of water, willing it to fade. Mercer glanced over. "Are you good, Captain?" "Yeah," she said, forcing a small smile. "Didn't sleep great last night. I'll be fine." Mercer nodded, though a part of him filed that away too. Pilots were trained not to ignore subtle changes in one another, even ones as small as posture or tone. At 35,000 feet, the world felt impossibly still, a flat sea of clouds stretching out beneath them. In the cabin, it was the same, a suspended calm where time seemed to blur. Daniel settled back, his eyes half closed, letting the hum of the engines wash over him. For him, the sound wasn't white noise, it was the heartbeat of the aircraft. Hayes shifted in his seat again, stretching his legs. He glanced over his shoulder, catching sight of the young man in 14B studying the chart with almost reverent focus. Hayes couldn't help himself. He leaned slightly toward the aisle and called back in a low voice. That a sectional? Daniel looked up, a little surprised, then nodded. Yes, sir. Dallas area. You a pilot? Hayes asked, not unkindly. Student pilot, Daniel said. Almost done with my hours. Hayes gave him a small nod, the kind a pilot gives another pilot, regardless of hours logged. Keep at it. It's worth it. Daniel's face lit up with a restrained but genuine pride. Thank you, sir. The moment passed, and they both returned to their respective seats, neither of them realizing they'd just begun a quiet connection that would matter more than they knew. The captain's voice came on again a few minutes later, giving the usual cruising update, but there was another subtle shift, a slight breathlessness, barely perceptible. Daniel's head tilted almost imperceptibly, the way a bird might when catching a sound from far off. Hayes heard it too. Neither man said anything. Not yet. In exactly 24 minutes, that silence would break. And when it did, everything they knew, everything they had trained for, would be tested in the thin, fragile air between earth and sky. The first sign came so quietly that most passengers didn't notice it at all. Just the faint, almost imperceptible change in engine pitch as the autopilot made a minute correction for wind shear. Daniel noticed. He always noticed. His eyes flicked to the nearest wing, watching the ailerons adjust, his fingers unconsciously mimicking the control yoke's micro-movements in the air beside his knee. Beside him, the grandmother had pulled out a paperback novel, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. The man in 14A was still hunched over his laptop, oblivious to the world beyond the spreadsheet columns glowing on his screen. Everything about the cabin screamed normal. But somewhere far ahead, past that closed cockpit door, something small had shifted. Captain Kingsley's headache had sharpened into something else entirely, a tight, throbbing pressure behind her eyes that made the overhead panel blur at the edges. She blinked hard, trying to focus on the numbers scrolling on the primary flight display. Mercer glanced at her again. You're pale, he said, his voice low, not wanting the interphone to pick it up. I'm fine, she murmured, but the word fine caught in her throat. She reached for her water bottle again and found her hand trembling slightly. Mercer's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he turned back to the radio, acknowledging an altitude change from center control. He'd been a first officer long enough to know when a captain was pushing through discomfort, and that sometimes pushing through wasn't an option. In row 12, Hayes unwrapped a small peppermint and let it dissolve slowly on his tongue. He'd flown enough combat missions to know that sometimes you got this itch in the back of your mind, a kind of anticipatory awareness that had no logical trigger but proved right more often than not. His gaze drifted again to the young man with the chart. The kid was still studying it, but now there was a faint crease between his brows, as if some part of him was also picking up on a shift. The seatbelt sign chimed on. Ladies and gentlemen, Kingsley's voice came again, faintly strained. We've got a little more chop ahead. Please make sure you're seated with your belts fastened. Most passengers didn't look up. A few grumbled softly about the inconvenience. Daniel, however, pressed his lips together and sat straighter. He'd heard turbulence announcements before. This wasn't turbulence, or at least, not the kind they were selling. The chop, when it came, was mild, just enough to set coffee rippling in plastic cups. Daniel felt it through the soles of his shoes, more a vibration than a jolt. The engines stayed steady. But in the cockpit, Kingsley had shifted from discomfort to genuine distress. Her vision tunneled, edges dimming, and she felt the sweat break cold across her skin. Mercer, she said, barely above a whisper. He turned just as her left hand slipped from the throttle, fingers splaying limply against the console. Captain. His voice was sharp now. I can't, she breathed, then her body slumped against the harness. Mercer's heart rate spiked instantly. His hand shot to the yoke, the other to the radio toggle. Mayday, 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 this is Skylink 237, Captain incapacitated, I have the controls. In the cabin, the announcement didn't come yet, not to the passengers. But Hayes caught the faint, clipped urgency of Mercer's voice bleeding through the reinforced door. His jaw tightened. He'd been in this position before, not in a 737, but in a cockpit where suddenly you were the only one left conscious who knew what to do. Daniel's eyes went wide. He didn't hear the words, but he heard the tone. And that was enough. The flight attendants were already moving forward, their faces schooled into practiced neutrality that didn't fool anyone paying close attention. The lead attendant tapped lightly on the cockpit door, murmured something, then disappeared inside. Row 12. Hayes unclipped his belt, leaning toward the aisle. A flight attendant was already hurrying past, but he caught her sleeve gently. "I'm a retired USAF pilot," he said in a calm, quiet tone meant for her ears only. "If you need help, you get me up there." She hesitated only half a second before nodding and moving forward. Daniel's hands were clenched on his knees. His breathing had quickened, not from fear exactly, but from the rising knowledge that the situation he had trained for in theory, pilot incapacitation, was unfolding in real life. In the cockpit, Mercer was juggling everything at once: control inputs, radio coordination with ATC, and the reality of a motionless captain beside him. His hands were steady, but his brain was already calculating margins. They were still a good 90 minutes from destination. He could divert, but handling the approach and landing solo under this stress? He'd take any qualified set of hands he could get. The attendant slipped back into the cabin, scanning the rows. "Sir," she said to Hayes. He was already halfway up. Daniel's voice came before he could stop himself. "I'm a pilot too." The attendant's eyes flicked to him, assessing the young man in the navy sweater with the earnest face. She had seconds to decide. Hayes glanced at Daniel, really looked at him for the first time. The chart, the deliberate movements, the spark of competence in his gaze. "You've got hours?" Hayes asked. Daniel nodded. "Student pilot. Single engine. I know radios, procedures, checklists." His voice was steady now, no hesitation. Hayes held his gaze for a beat, then nodded once. "Come on, kid." And just like that, the unremarkable man in 14B, the one most passengers had barely noticed, was on his feet, walking down the aisle toward the cockpit, side by side with a man who'd once flown combat missions. Every head turned. Nobody spoke. Somewhere above the steady drone of the engines, you could feel the collective heartbeat of the cabin change. The aisle felt impossibly long as Daniel followed Hayes toward the front. He was aware of every vibration through the floor panels, every subtle sway of the fuselage as they pushed through a light crosswind. He kept his hands loose at his sides, resisting the urge to fidget, but inside, every cell was on alert. The forward galley was a sudden pocket of concentrated activity. One attendant was crouched near the cockpit door, headset plugged into the wall panel, speaking in hushed but rapid tones. Another stood just beyond her, eyes darting between Hayes, Daniel, and the cabin behind them. "This is him," the attendant said to the one with the headset, gesturing toward Hayes. Then, with a brief hesitation, "And this young man, he's a student pilot." The crouched attendant's brows rose. "Both of you." Hayes gave a curt nod. "Let us in." The reinforced door buzzed, unlocked with a mechanical thunk, and swung inward just far enough for them to slip through one at a time. The cockpit was a narrow, high-tech cave lit by glowing instrument panels and the muted daylight beyond the windshield. Mercer sat in the left seat now, the captain's seat, his headset clamped tight, one hand on the yoke, the other adjusting a knob on the autopilot control panel. His expression was composed, but his eyes flicked to them instantly, relief flashing just briefly before he turned back to the instruments. On the right seat, Captain Kingsley was slumped, her harness holding her upright, but her chin tipped toward her chest. Her breathing was shallow, her skin ashen under the cap's shadow. Hayes's voice went all business. "What's your situation?" "Stable for now," Mercer said, his tone clipped. "We're on autopilot, but I'm not landing this thing alone with her out cold. Closest divert is 200 miles east, but weather's rough there. I can manage the approach, but I need someone on radios and checklists." "Done," Hayes said, already sliding into the jump seat behind Mercer. Daniel stood just inside the door, eyes locked on the scene. The sheer density of information, the glowing numbers, the rows of switches, the hum of the avionics, was dizzying at first. But then training kicked in. Pattern recognition. Every simulator session, every hour spent in the cramped Cessna cockpit, every quiz card he'd drilled at night came rushing back in clear, steady lines. Mercer glanced at him. "You the student pilot?" "Yes, sir." "You comfortable reading a first officer checklist if I call it?" Daniel's mouth went dry, but he forced the word out steady. "Yes." Mercer gave a quick nod toward the right side seat, where Kingsley sat unmoving. "Stand there for now. Your eyes and hands if I need them. Understand?" "Yes, sir." Hayes leaned in toward Daniel, voice low but firm. "You follow instructions exactly. No freelancing. And you do not freeze." Daniel met his gaze. "I won't." For the first time, Hayes allowed himself a fractional smile. "Good." Mercer toggled the radio. "Center, Skylink 237, we have 2 additional pilots in the cockpit. one retired military, one student pilot, assisting. Request vectors for nearest suitable field with medical services. The reply crackled through, calm but purposeful. Skylink 237 copy. Stand by for reroute. Daniel's heart was pounding, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was something hotter, cleaner, the razor-sharp edge of focus that came only when everything mattered. His hands itched to move, to help, to do, but he kept them still until told otherwise. Behind them, the door sealed shut again with a heavy click, cutting off the curious eyes from the cabin. In this narrow space, time felt different, compressed, each second stretching and snapping like taut wire. Hayes reached for a clipboard from the side panel, flipping to the emergency protocols. His voice was steady as he read aloud, Mercer responding in crisp confirmations. The rhythm of it filled the space, a drumbeat of procedure over the muted roar of the engines. Daniel stood poised, watching the sweep of the altimeter, the steady crawl of the heading bug across the display. His mind mapped the situation in 3 dimensions. Their altitude, their speed, their potential diversion fields, as if the glass cockpit displays were speaking a language only he could hear. The first officer's voice cut through. All right, Daniel, grab the quick reference. Read me the incapacitated crew member checklist. Daniel reached for the laminated booklet clipped to the side panel. His fingers found the right tab instantly. Confirm incapacitation, secure harness, oxygen if necessary. Mercer's hands moved in perfect sync with the words, checking each box in a fluid sequence. Good, he said without looking back. You've done this before. In the sim, Daniel admitted. It counts, Mercer replied, and there was no hint of condescension, just acknowledgement. Hayes took over the radios, freeing Mercer to focus on hand flying. Center, Skylink 237, request medical on arrival. Passenger manifest indicates trained medical personnel on board if needed. Roger, Skylink 237, will have EMS standing by. Daniel's eyes flicked once more to Kingsley. She was still breathing, but shallow, her skin pale and damp. The sight hit him harder than he expected. Not because she was the captain, but because she was someone who had walked onto this plane hours ago strong and in control, and now. He tightened his grip on the checklist. Focus. Mercer exhaled slowly, his voice steady but taut. All right, let's bring her home. And in that moment, in that sealed, humming space hurtling 30,000 feet above the ground, Daniel understood that nothing in his young life had prepared him for this, and everything had. The reroute came fast. Skylink 237, turn left heading 090, descend and maintain flight level 250. Expect vectors into Jacksonville International. Hayes read it back while Mercer rolled the yoke, the nose dipping gently. Outside, the late afternoon light slanted in golden bands across a layer of scattered cumulus, shadows spilling like slow-moving rivers over the tops. The sun's angle painted the ocean in molten copper streaks far below, and for an instant it looked calm, too calm, compared to the tension in the cockpit. Daniel stayed at the captain's right shoulder, checklist still in his grip, eyes moving between the primary flight display and the navigation screen. Jacksonville was already a green dot creeping closer on the moving map, its approach lines fanning outward like a spider's web. Mercer gave a half-smile without looking away from the horizon. See it? Daniel nodded. Yes, sir. Looks like they'll bring us in from the east side. That's my guess, too, Mercer said. Good eye. Hayes leaned forward, adjusting a knob on the comm panel. Tower says we've got gusting crosswinds down there, 20 knots off the right. Runway 26 in use. You've got a gust factor to think about. Copy, Mercer replied. Daniel's mind instantly replayed every simulator session involving a crosswind approach. The way the nose had to be crabbed into the wind, the last-second rudder and aileron corrections before touchdown. The margin for error shrank with every knot of gust. The descent continued, the soft hiss of airflow over the fuselage deepening into a low, constant rush. At 22,000 feet, the clouds thickened, white walls sliding past the cockpit windows in slow motion. The horizon disappeared, replaced by the bright gray of overcast light. Mercer toggled the seatbelt sign again. Cabin crew, prepare for landing. Let's keep it smooth for as long as we can. Hayes turned to Daniel. All right, he's flying. I'm on radios. You're monitoring airspeed, altitude, and call out any deviations beyond 10 knots or 100 feet. Think you can handle that? Daniel's chest swelled. Yes, sir. The first bump hit at 15,000 feet, a quick sideways lurch that rattled the harness straps. Mercer's left hand tightened on the yoke, right hand easing the throttles forward slightly to keep the speed stable. Outside, the cloud breaks showed glints of coastline now, ribbons of pale sand, marshland glittering in the slanted light, the dark lines of runways still miles away. Skylink 237, reduce speed to 210, descend and maintain 6,000. 210, 6,000, Hayes read back. Daniel's voice cut in, steady. Speed's coming back, holding 212, altitude passing 8,000 for 6. Good, Mercer said, eyes still on the horizon. The cockpit door buzzed once, a chime from the cabin crew, and Hayes pressed the intercom. Go ahead. A voice came back, hushed but urgent. We've got a nurse with the captain. She's stable, still unconscious. No change. Understood, Hayes said, then to Mercer. We get her down quick. She's got a shot. Mercer nodded, jaw tight. Working on it. At 4,000 feet, the wind hit harder, buffeting the aircraft in short, sharp jolts. The sun had dipped just enough to make the cockpit lighting take over, instruments glowing in soft blues and greens against the deepening sky. Hayes scanned the approach chart in his lap. ILS for 26, decision height 200 feet. Autopilot or handfly. Mercer didn't hesitate. Handfly. Daniel knew what that meant, trust in muscle memory, in real stick and rudder feel, not just the glass and code of the flight director. All right, Hayes said, voice calm. You've got 20 knots off the right. Daniel, you're watching drift. If he's left or right of centerline, call it. Yes, sir. The radio crackled. Skylink 237, you're cleared ILS 26 approach, contact tower 118.3. Cleared 26, over to tower, Hayes replied. He switched frequencies. Jacksonville Tower, Skylink 237, on the ILS 26. Skylink 237, Jacksonville Tower, winds 280 at 20 gusting 28, runway 26 cleared to land. Daniel swallowed. That was a tough crosswind. 3 miles out, the runway appeared, a thin dark strip against the glow of the city lights, shimmering slightly in the heat rising from its surface. The wind rocked the plane again, and Mercer adjusted instantly, banking just enough to keep the nose aligned. Daniel's voice was calm but firm. Airspeed 152 stable. Slight drift left. Correcting, Mercer said. 2 miles. The precision approach path indicator lights, 2 white, 2 red, glowed steady in the twilight. The ground rushed up in the windshield, every second bringing them closer to the decision point. Daniel's pulse hammered. He could hear the faint roar of wind under the fuselage, feel every twitch of the yoke through the airframe's subtle shutters. 1 mile. Hayes' voice was low. Hold it steady, you've got her. Mercer's focus never wavered. The gusts hit again, harder this time, and the plane rocked, but the nose stayed true. Decision height. Daniel's breath caught as Mercer eased the throttles, eyes locked forward. The runway markings were bright now, rushing toward them. And then, the left wing dipped, the gusts slamming them sideways. Mercer countered instantly, but Daniel saw it, the angle, the proximity, and knew the margin was gone. Daniel's fingers tightened on the yoke frame instinctively, though he wasn't the one flying. The sudden roll had a violence to it, a sharp slap of wind that came out of nowhere, the kind that stole a second from your reaction time and dared you to get it back. Mercer's left hand pushed against the yoke, right hand easing in coordinated rudder. The movements sharp but smooth, the way someone might grab a falling glass without spilling a drop. Hold it, Hayes murmured beside him, eyes locked on the runway centerline. The instruments flickered in Daniel's peripheral vision. Airspeed steady, glide slope needle-centered, but outside, the world was alive and shifting. The runway's white lines slid fractionally under the nose, then snapped back as Mercer corrected. The crosswind hit again, heavier, a shudder running down the length of the fuselage. Daniel felt it through the soles of his shoes. The way the landing gear strained against physics it wasn't designed to love. 50 feet. The ground was no longer a far-off thing. It was right there, rushing up at angles the body couldn't quite reconcile. Mercer kicked the rudder, rolling the wings level, nose still crabbing slightly into the wind to keep from drifting off course. Hayes' right hand hovered near the throttle, ready for a go-around call, but his jaw stayed set. Centerline, hold centerline. Daniel called, voice level but louder now, just enough to cut through the roar in the cockpit. 20 feet. The runway's texture was visible now, tiny cracks and patches illuminated in the landing lights. Mercer's corrections were quick now, rudder tap, aileron shift, throttle pulse, like a musician finding the downbeat in a song that kept threatening to lose time. 10 feet. The right main gear touched first, a brief, squealing kiss of rubber and asphalt. Then the left, the nose following an instant later. The gusts didn't quit, still shoving at the tail as Mercer brought the reversers online, the sound in the cockpit swelling into a deep, vibrating thunder. 60 knots, Hayes called, and the world seemed to slow. The rudder held them true down the center line, reversers stowing, brakes easing them toward taxi speed. Only then did Daniel realize he'd been holding his breath. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mercer's voice came over the PA, calm and unshaken. "Welcome to Jacksonville." The applause began before he'd even finished. Taxiing in, the terminal lights growing brighter, the adrenaline still buzzing in Daniel's veins, Hayes finally turned in his seat and gave him a look that was part approval, part quiet calculation. "You did good up here," he said. "Real good." Daniel managed a small smile, though his throat felt tight. "Just did what you told me, sir." Hayes shook his head. "No, you did more than that. You stayed sharp when it counted." The cabin door opened as they parked at the gate, medics rushing aboard to take the captain. Passengers craned their necks, catching sight of Daniel in the cockpit, headset still around his neck, checklist in hand. To them, he was no longer the unremarkable man in 14B. He was part of the crew that got them home. But for Daniel, the moment wasn't about heroics. It was about proving, to himself, to the faces that had underestimated him his whole life, that he belonged in that seat. The terminal smelled faintly of jet fuel and wet pavement as passengers filed out into the bright artificial light, voices still pitched higher than normal, like they hadn't fully come down from what just happened. Most didn't understand exactly what had occurred, only that something had gone wrong in the cockpit and someone had stepped in to help. Daniel stepped into the jet bridge last, his worn carry-on slung over one shoulder, still wearing the faint crease of the headset on his hair. He kept his head low, not from shame, but because the noise of gratitude was almost overwhelming. "Thank you, man. Hey, you were up there, right? You saved us." He nodded politely, murmuring, "Glad you're safe," to each voice, but he didn't linger. His eyes tracked ahead to where Hayes stood near the gate desk, arms folded, speaking quietly with an airline manager and one of the medics. When Hayes saw Daniel, he motioned him over. "Stay put for a sec," Hayes said in a low tone. "The airline wants to talk to you. And so do a few reporters." Daniel blinked. "Reporters?" Hayes smirked. "Word travels fast when a passenger with Down syndrome helps land a 737 in crosswinds." The words landed heavier than Daniel expected. It wasn't that he was ashamed of the diagnosis. He never had been. But being reduced to it in the headlines felt strange, like people might think that was the whole story. They wouldn't see the hours he'd logged in the Cessna, the nights spent hunched over manuals until his eyes blurred, the instructors who'd stopped doubting him only after he proved them wrong in the sky. But Hayes's hand landed on his shoulder, grounding him. "Don't let them define it for you. You tell it your way." Within minutes, Daniel found himself in front of two local news cameras, the gate area now a small island of curious onlookers. The reporter, a woman with a voice trained for calm delivery, leaned in with a warm smile. "We're here at Jacksonville International, where passengers are calling a fellow traveler a hero. Sir, can you tell us what happened up there?" Daniel hesitated, then spoke in the even, measured tone he used in flight school check-ins. "The captain got sick. Colonel Hayes here asked if I knew my way around a cockpit. I'm a student pilot, so I followed his instructions, backed up the first officer on callouts, helped keep eyes on instruments while they focused on flying." The reporter's brows lifted. "A student pilot?" "Yes, ma'am. Been training for almost 2 years. I work part-time, save up for flight hours. It's slow going, but I love it." He glanced at Hayes. "Today was different, but we were a team. I didn't land the plane. I was part of making sure it landed safely." The humility was genuine, but the effect was immediate. Murmurs spread through the terminal, phones lifted higher to capture video, and somewhere beyond the glare of the camera light, Daniel saw a teenage boy watching him intently, eyes wide like he'd just seen something new was possible. By the time he left the terminal, the footage had already been clipped, captioned, and posted online. His phone buzzed in his pocket with messages from friends, instructors, and a few people he hadn't heard from in years. The next morning, the story hit national outlets. Passenger with Down syndrome assists in emergency landing. Student pilot steps up at 35,000 feet. Quiet Hero helps guide 737 to safety. Daniel read the headlines from the small kitchen table in his apartment, the hum of his fridge filling the silence. He didn't feel like a hero. What he felt was a sharp, steady pride, not for the event itself, but for the years that had led to it. He thought back to the first time he'd told his mother he wanted to fly. She'd smiled, but her eyes had carried that quiet worry parents get when their child dreams too big. Flight school had been a wall of skeptical glances, extra evaluations, and instructors who spoke too slowly at first, as if he might not keep up. But he had. Flight by flight, page by page of the training manual, he'd built a body of proof. Not to shout down his doubters, but to drown them out with skill. Now, here he was, the unremarkable man in seat 14B. In living rooms across the country, his voice explaining calmly how teamwork and preparation matter more than fear. Hayes called later that afternoon. "Kid, you've got an open invite to come fly right seat with me anytime I'm in a simulator. You've got instincts you can't teach." Daniel smiled into the phone. "Thank you, sir. I'll take you up on that." When the call ended, he looked at the framed photo on his desk. Him at the airfield on his first solo, headset askew, grin too big for his face. He thought about what Hayes had said in the gate area. Don't let them define it for you. You tell it your way. And he knew he would. Because the truth wasn't that a man with Down syndrome had helped land a plane. The truth was that a pilot, who happened to have Down syndrome, had done what pilots do. Kept his head, trusted his training, and brought everyone home safe.